if I wanted to hit my calorie deficit numbers, I could do that eating protein shakes and Oreos, but that's going to be really hard for me to stick to that deficit because I'm going to be hungry all the time. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Truth Talks, the podcast that brings you real strategies for sustainable fitness transformation. I'm Courtney, and this is my brother Paris. And if you joined us last week, we talked about why fat loss can feel so hard sometimes. And today we're going to try to make it feel a little bit more practical to make it feel even easier. So, Paris.
Yes.
Did you have any thoughts on last week's episode that you want to use to kick off this week's episode?
I thought it was pretty good. It's why fat loss for some people in certain instances can feel challenging, and I'm sure it's like relatable for a lot of people listening. And today we want to talk about how can we make it easier? And we know we need to be in a calorie deficit if we need to lose weight, and if we want to be productive with fat loss. Of course, it's probably a good idea for us to be in a calorie deficit. So in this episode, we're pretty much going to say, how do we make it easier to be consistently in a calorie deficit?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think if you've tuned into many of these episodes, not just last week's, you've heard us talk time and time again about how essential a calorie deficit is. It was even one of our 5 truths that we talked about. And we're talking about in the essential for weight loss and fat. And like you said, most arguably fat loss too. So we've said it time and time again that you need a calorie deficit, but we haven't quite spent enough time actually talking about how to get there. And so today is going to take that concept and make it a little bit more practical. The first thing to making a calorie deficit feel easy, I'm just going to dive right into it, is actually knowing if you're in one. Because, right? Like we taught, and knowing why it matters. Last week when we talked about why fat loss can feel so challenging, we said, well, because a lot of people don't actually understand the nutrition principles. So I think first and foremost, you need to actually understand, what is a calorie deficit? And that is consuming fewer calories than your body expends. We've talked about that at length, and I'll link a few episodes that are relevant in the description below that go into that concept in more details. But you have to actually know, what does a calorie deficit look like for you?
Yep, absolutely. And that's where people are like, I'm in a calorie deficit. It's like, well, how do you know that? Like, do you know even what you're eating? Like, are you tracking, or do you even know your numbers? So I think that's like the first thing. If you don't have any experience tracking and you have no idea, how many calories you need to maintain your weight, gain weight, or lose weight, you can start with just using some sort of equation online. The most famous one, the Harris-Benedict equation. And we also do have like a calculator on our website that you can use as well. But you got to remember that these are not perfect, but they are good starting points. Okay. So, if you have no idea where to start with your numbers and no idea, what amount of calories would be a calorie deficit for me, then you can at least start with those to give you a reference point. Who knows? Maybe those numbers are going to work for you. But for a lot of people, you're probably going to have to tweak them once you get going. And then you'll be able to kind of really know your numbers. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think if you use those equations, and they can also help you, or our calculator, it can also help you just get your maintenance calories, right? Because the thing is, a calorie deficit is relative. It is relative to what you need to maintain your body weight, right? So if you use those calculators and they can help you give you your sense of your maintenance calories, then the next step would be, I'm going to generalize, and I know you're going to have a great perspective on this because it's different for everybody, but start to think of, a calorie deficit is probably going to be in the range of 500 calories fewer than your maintenance calories. And usually that's a reasonable starting point for most people.
Yeah, obviously depending on, where you're at in your fitness journey, how lean you are already, everything else going on, and what your day-to-day looks like. You might be more or less assertive with the deficit, but I think, if you're ballparking for somewhere around a 500 calorie deficit per day, not a bad spot. It could be less in certain instances. It could be even more in certain instances as well. But I think that, that's not a bad ballpark to start with.
Yeah. So to start making fat loss easier, know actually how many calories you need to put yourself into a calorie deficit, right? Yeah. I think a lot of people get tempted to just be like, I'm just going to eat a lot less. And what ends up happening is, first of all, eating less isn't necessarily the same as eating fewer calories, right?
That's a good point.
Which is an interesting thing. Also, sometimes then people just completely undereat, and maybe they could have actually saved themselves some struggle, right?
Yeah.
And by eating a little bit more and still being in a calorie deficit. So I think there's purpose in knowing your calorie deficit numbers, not just to make sure, am I actually in a deficit, but also to make sure that deficit is reasonable Because the second thing that makes fat loss and a calorie deficit easier is, and I'm going to say for most people, because there is a time and a place for more aggressive or assertive fat loss protocols. We did a whole episode on mini cuts, which would be a great example of that. So I'm going to say if you're starting out with fat loss and you're trying to figure out how do I make this easier for myself when I'm maybe less experienced with this, or I've found it really challenging before, then having a reasonable deficit that is not how do I eat the fewest amount of calories possible is really important. I'm going to let you speak, but I have to just share one more thing, if I may.
Yes, go for it.
The perspective I like to think about when we're choosing a calorie deficit is finding that sweet spot, okay? So our sweet spot is how can I eat as many calories as possible while still seeing the rate of progress that I want to and expect to see, right? Yeah. Because we still need enough calories to fuel our days and our training performance and all of that and our mood and all of that. But at the same time, we want to see progress. So I think step one was know your calorie deficit numbers. Step two is pick the number that's actually reasonable to see progress and not just dropping it as low as possible.
Very well said. Yeah. And then also here's the problem. If you just say, oh, I'm just going to eat a lot less, when you inevitably hit some sort of plateau or perceived plateau, like where do you go from there? Like if you don't if you don't know your numbers, then you also don't know when or if adjustments are needed and how to adjust along the way. So I think that's also something that people don't think about. And, you know, if you're just starting your fat loss journey, you're starting, you know, at maybe a higher body fat percentage, maybe for the first bit, you can get away with, okay, I'm just going to eat a little bit better and quote unquote, clean up my diet a little bit. And maybe that will give you the first kind of breakthrough of progress. But there's going to be a time where you're just going to have to get more specific. I'm sorry. Like you can't just, you know, free ball your way all the way to like your most dream physique in terms of leanness, unless you already have a tons of knowledge surrounding, you know, all your numbers and everything like that and skills, which is, it wouldn't be the case in this context. So,
separate conversation. But if you're already there, you're probably not feeling like a calorie deficit is hard. Yeah, right.
That's
like
true.
If you're at that level already, then this conversation is not necessarily for you. That's true. For people who are starting at like a higher body fat percentage, you touched on something really important, right? You can just kind of try to make some adjustments to eat less with maybe not knowing as precise of your numbers. And like for a lot of clients that we onboard that are starting with higher body fat percentages, we often give them like max calories, right? Because they typically might feel less hungry because they have energy stores, right? Or there's other things that kind of go into that decision. But instead of just trying to maybe, you know, it's not eat as few calories as possible, but at the same time, it's like, okay, as long as we stay under this, if you go a little lower, maybe then we would think that's also okay in those cases.
Yeah, exactly. Or just giving kind of like a wider range or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, no, that's a good point. So yeah, definitely. And also, I think it just removes some guessing, because if you're like, okay, you know what, I want to be in a calorie deficit, I want to lose some weight and lose some body fat, but then you're like, okay, I'm just going to kind of just try to eat healthy-ish or whatever, then you're going to wonder, am I doing the right things? And you're going to potentially waste time if you're not. And then even if you do see progress, you're not really sure why you saw progress. And if you don't see progress, you're also not going to be sure why. So that's why knowing your numbers has like multiple different benefits.
I'm so glad you said that point on even if it works, you don't know why. Because if you need to keep doing something consistently, or if you need to do it again in the future and you don't know why, you don't even know where to start then, right? So knowing your numbers is super, super important to recognize what's driving success and also what might not be. It's both sides of that equation.
Yeah.
Okay. We talked about making calorie deficits feel easier by actually knowing what a calorie deficit looks like for you and deciding on a range that you can stick to consistently. That's a reasonable rate of fat loss progress for you. But that's the first thing. That's like the strategic, how do you make it easier strategically? But just like we did last week, we kind of said like, okay, here's the overarching things, here's the practical things. We're going to do the same thing here. When we now talk practicalities, let's say you figured out, okay, I know my numbers. Well, there are a million different ways you can hit those numbers. And I will give you one example. If I wanted to hit my calorie deficit numbers, I could do that eating protein shakes and Oreos. And I say that a lot, actually, if I really wanted to. But that's going to be really hard for me to stick to that deficit because I'm going to be hungry all the time because I'm going to blow through those calories really quickly.
Yeah. So there's no satiety. There's no like good energy that you're going to get from that. Your training would probably suck. Your mental clarity would suck. Your digestion would be way off, you know, everything.
Exactly. And I'd have like no micronutrients either, like
Yeah.
no fiber, like no vitamins and minerals from fruits and veggies. So there's a lot of complications with that. But the reason I bring that up is because the next step to making a calorie deficit feel easier has to do with food selection. Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
And there are a few food selection criteria that we're going to talk about here. I'm going to let you say the first one. But really, the foods you choose have an impact on how easy it feels to stick to a calorie deficit.
Yeah, I think the first one is definitely eating for volume. Okay, so like example, if I eat 500 calories of Oreos, I could probably easily eat another 500 calories of Oreos, no problem, and be like, where's the next 500 calories of Oreos? Because it's not filling at all, right? It's super tasty. But if I have 500 calories of boiled potatoes and veggies and apple, I'm going to be pretty full, and I'm much less inclined to want to then overeat. So I feel like if you choose foods that give you less calories for more volume, so they take up more space, it's going to be more filling. You will be physically eating for a longer period of time as well, which will help you kind of be in touch with your hunger and satiety cues as well, which is another benefit. And it's just going to make you feel like you're not in a calorie deficit even when you are.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the difference between, I eat a lot versus I eat a little. The calories can actually be the same, right? Yeah. Like when somebody says, I don't eat that much. I'm like, okay, but that has nothing to do with your calorie intake, right?
Yes. The amount.
So,
yeah.
The amount. Exactly. Yeah. So when you're trying to adhere to a calorie deficit, you can actually eat a lot of food physically if you play your cards right and you choose the right foods. Like when you were saying the 500 calorie examples, I kept thinking about like watermelon or strawberries as well, right? Yeah. Like huge volume foods. So if you pick the right foods, you can be really full in a calorie deficit. Yeah. Maybe not really full, but you can be full enough and satiated enough.
Yeah.
Sure. And the number one reason that that's important is because it's going to feel easier if you're not hungry. Mm-hmm. I said this on the podcast that we did specifically about managing hunger, but if you are hungry, everything else feels hard. Paris, you're my brother. You know what I'm like when I'm hangry. It's not a good look.
Yeah. God forbid I say anything. Courtney's.
We make sure I eat before we record the podcast.
Yeah, seriously. Oh my gosh. But I think that's a big one that a lot of people don't think about. It's like once you have your numbers, then we need to start thinking about food selection. The first one is volume eating. You want to toss out the second one?
The second one is, I'm going to actually say protein, right? And making sure you're preserving protein, because with a calorie deficit, our goal for most people is fat loss, not weight loss. And that's why we talked about why can fat loss be hard last week? Because fat loss, we want to try to preserve muscle, right? And so when we prioritize protein, it does that job. It helps us do that job when it's paired with a resistance training program.
Yeah.
But it's not even just about the physique benefits of protein. Like obviously preserving muscle is really, really important for bone density, functional movement, and, longevity and aging, all of those things too. So it is important that we take care of that. And you might be sitting there being like, well, that doesn't necessarily make it easier, but let me keep going with this for a second and point out why I think it makes it easier. Okay. Mm-hmm. The first reason is protein is also the most satiating macronutrient, meaning that it tends to have a more filling effect compared to carbs and fats. I mean, everybody has their different perceptions of how they feel after eating it, but I don't know. Do you find that as well? Do you find that it has that satiating effect?
Oh, for sure. It totally does. Yeah.
We have clients who will be like, I'm kind of full when they start eating more protein, right? It's like there's that surprising impact. Absolutely. I'm actually feeling more full. So again, it's a hunger management strategy. But I'm going to say now the number one reason why I think focusing on protein makes fat loss easier, okay? Because now you're stripping back some of the guesswork of what do I need to eat to get into a calorie deficit, and you have a clear focus point to build your meals around it, right? So if you start with, I think if you're trying to figure out how do I get to a calorie deficit, like I said, we started this conversation with, you can choose any foods, but if you start with protein, it gives you direction to build your meals. So you're not sitting there guessing, what am I going to eat to make my calorie deficit work? You now have your anchor points, and that makes the process a lot easier for meal planning and strategy.
That's interesting perspective. Yeah, yeah. It's like the foundation of every meal. Like you start there and kind of build out from there. Yeah. And
Yeah,
the satiety
exactly.
benefits are definitely huge, like huge
Mhm.
for sure.
Yeah. So
I
protein
like
is
it.
like twofold. It's
Yeah.
strategic in terms of giving you some structure. It's strategic in terms of offering satiety. And I'm going to throw one more third benefit out there for protein here: an abundance mindset. Because we talked about how we also want to find that sweet spot, right? Between like, okay, we're still, eating enough while still seeing progress.
Yeah.
And protein helps us have an abundance mindset because it's something where we're focused on like more of and in
Getting
the
enough of.
inclusion of
Yes, yes, yes,
eating
yes.
enough of. Yeah.
Yeah.
Instead of seeing a calorie deficit as inherently restrictive.
Okay. I like that mindset. I haven't actually heard that one before. Yeah. Yeah. Cause everything else is like you're controlling and limiting, per
Mhm.
se. And then the protein's one where you're trying to get more of so you can hit that target, like getting up to the target. So
Yeah.
that's cool.
Yeah, and
I like
I do
that.
think there's a psychological benefit to that too, right? Because the psychological ease of a calorie deficit does matter. It's not just the
Oh, yeah.
functional like hunger and all that. It's also like the psychological ease. And when you're not thinking about scaling everything back and getting into this
Mhm.
like scarcity mindset and you preserve some of that abundance feeling, it makes it feel easier. It's like, oh, I can have that, or I will have that, or I'm choosing to have that instead of being like, I'm
Yeah.
not sure about this.
So true. So true. So
Yeah.
we said, okay, so we started with for food selection, we want volume eating, high protein, and or just focus on protein. And then the last one would be, which kind of goes with food volume in a way, but it's just like maybe reducing some of the liquid calories or sauce calories.
Let's call
Um,
it accessory calories. I'm going to go with that. Accessory calories. How's
okay.
that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Because like I don't think people realize like just the sauces, oils, and soft drinks, juices, whatever, like that can easily be an extra like 800 calories a day and can
Mm-hmm.
take you not only from out of a calorie deficit but also into a calorie surplus. Like let's say I
Mm-hmm.
have an extra orange juice in the morning, all right, maybe it's 120 140 calories, and then I'm putting some syrup on my pancakes or whatever, all right, if it's full sugar syrup, like could be another 100 calories, and then that's only just in my breakfast. And then if we think about things later in the day, maybe barbecue sauce on my chicken for dinner, and then maybe I'm having a Coke at dinner or a beer or something. That's a whole other conversation. But these are easily consumed calories that don't have much of a satiety benefit for us. Right? Like if I have
Mm-hmm.
like a full sugar Coke, for example, it's like all right, I drank it and I could
Mm-hmm.
easily have another one. Like it's not like, oh, I'm so full, I had this liquid, So I think it's just something to think about. And when hunger management is such a big thing in a calorie deficit, you want to think about, okay, what is actually going to give me the best bang for a buck? And usually sauces and yeah, and drinks are not the way to go.
That's true. And I think it's definitely like going back to everything's harder when you're hungry. That is the main
Yeah,
benefit of those things is because they don't really offer solutions to hunger, right? They're not
yeah,
a hunger solution. But because you know me and because I'm thinking about the psychology and all that again and the structural benefit, when you think about moderating those foods, the liquids, the beverages, the sauces, the quote unquote accessory calories, you don't have to change your meal setup that much, right? You don't really need to think too much about like, how am I building this plate in a different way for fat loss versus, your regular eating
true. Yeah,
habits. And like, I did this post once where I literally took my plate of dinner and it was like, okay, quinoa, I think it was tilapia and zucchini. Okay. And that was my plate. And then for me, because I'm currently in a calorie surplus, I'm actually doing the inverse, which is adding, but I added
yeah,
pesto on my fish, olive oil on my zucchini, and oh no, it wasn't quinoa, it was potatoes. So then I had like a
okay,
dipping sauce for my potatoes. Okay.
gotcha.
So if you think about that, I easily added 150 calories like that,
Yeah,
just from like those like extra flavor things that I added. The reverse is also true. I could take away the pesto, take away the extra olive oil, and take away that dipping sauce. My meal is the same. I'm still
yeah.
eating potatoes, fish, and zucchini.
So true. Or if we want to think about keeping that abundance mindset, we just swap things. So, for
Yes.
example, like let's say you had instead of oil, like you added another low calorie sauce that added some taste, or the dip you just made a less calorie dense version. So a lot of these
Right.
things, are not like takeaways. It's just swapping. I think
Mm-hmm.
that's a good mindset to have. Even like with my Coke example, it's like, what if I just had a Diet Coke or something, or a diet soft drink? Or there's always nowadays we live in a world with so many awesome seasonings and low calorie sauces and options to make
Mm-hmm.
things taste
Mm-hmm.
good. So sometimes it's not again about removing; it's just about making strategic swaps.
I really like that you said that. We're going to maintain that abundance mindset thread.
Yeah.
I really like that. I really like that because, yeah, you're right. Like, instead of my, Nando's Peronaise, which actually is fairly efficient on calories. So let's pretend I had like a full like aioli. Okay.
Yeah.
So instead of the aioli, what if I made a yogurt based dip, right?
Yeah.
That was yogurt and chipotle seasoning mixed together. And I made my own chipotle dip for my potatoes.
Yeah,
I could easily save 100 calories right there, right? But I'm still having the integrity of what I wanted, which was a dip for my potatoes that tastes like Chipotle.
Perfect. I like it. Yeah.
So I'm glad you threw that one in there. Swaps. So food selection. Now, to round up where we're at, volume eating, protein priorities, less liquid sauces like accessory calories, or also swapping different food choices.
Strategic swaps. Yeah.
Right? Strategic swaps. And I think I'm going to play off your strategic swaps a little bit more here, because to tie it into that idea of volume eating as well, we can also choose to swap out things we might usually have for less calorie dense versions. So, for example, every morning in my oats, I put a fruit. Okay. If you put a banana, I love bananas. I'm going to continue to eat bananas. Yes, you can eat bananas and still lose body fat. Yes, you can eat bananas in a calorie deficit. I have to put that disclaimer. However, bananas are a more calorie dense fruit option than strawberries.
Yep.
So if I were to swap my banana for strawberries, that could be more efficient in calories and help me hit a deficit.
Definitely. Or even like, okay, instead of the ground beef, I'm having a leaner version of it, or lean ground turkey or something. Like, these little swaps throughout the day can literally save you several hundred calories or more. And that's why we have to reframe the mindset, as you were talking about earlier, of it's not necessarily eating less amount of food. It's just being strategic with what foods we're choosing, and also knowing our numbers and knowing what foods are going to help us hit those numbers.
Yeah. Absolutely. Any other swaps you want to put out there before we move on to the next thing that can make calorie deficit easier?
No, okay. I think we said
amazing.
It. Yeah.
Cool. So when it comes to making a calorie deficit easier, we talked a lot about how what you can eat can make it feel more seamless and smoother and easier to hit your numbers. The other thing too to consider is how you eat can make it harder or easier, right? And we kind of alluded to this concept of like meal structures and things like that as we talked about food selection. But let's actually spend a minute talking about why meal structure matters to make a calorie deficit easier.
I think the first one is just removing the decisions. And then also, you're more likely to be consistent and predictable with your energy and hunger management. Because if I just randomly eat meals throughout the day, I might be landing at 4 p.m. and being like, well, I have 50 calories left. Like, what did I do? Versus if you have a very predictable kind of quote unquote system for your day in terms of, how many meals you're having, when those meals are, and what types of meals, you're choosing to hit your numbers, then all of a sudden, we removed a lot of decisions, but also we're now going to optimize for energy and satiety just by virtue of the structure. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't think about. And also, even just knowing like these are my meal times. If you're like a little bit hungry, you're like, nope, like I'm eating, in 30 minutes or whatever, I'll be fine. Like, yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to give us a sense of like, when we talk about meal structure, it's really routines, right? Yeah. What are your routines in terms of how many times a day you eat and kind of the timing of that?
Yeah. So right now I'm in like a slight surplus, so it's a little bit different. But honestly, the timing of my meals does not change when I'm in a fat loss phase, but the meal amounts to, and even I would say the baseline meals don't even change. It's just what Courtney was saying before, where you give and take some things. So my structure right now is I'll usually wake up, depending on the day, anywhere between like 6 and 6:40. And then I shower and just sit right down at my desk with my electrolytes or flavored water of some sort and coffee. And then I'll work from whatever time it is, anywhere from like 6:30 to 7 all the way to like 10:30 ish, depending on the day, maybe a bit earlier if I'm hungry. And then I'll have my first meal. Okay. And then I'll do another block of work between like an hour and a half to 2 hours of work, and then I'll go for the gym, come back from the gym, have another meal, okay, around maybe like somewhere around 2 p.m. Then I'll have another meal around like, let's say 4:30, and then my last meal is between 7:30 around there. So 4 meals, and I push the first one back so I can focus on work, and that way it saves some calories for later in the day. Yeah.
So if we run with that, I just want to use your experience to showcase the value in that structure to make a calorie deficit easier. Because it doesn't matter right now that you're in a slight surplus. We're going to use your experience as an example. if you know you have 4 meals a day and you know when you're going to eat those 4 meals, let's now talk about how that makes planning your nutrition for a calorie deficit easier. Okay.
Super easy. Yeah.
Super easy. You can, if you're a math person, you can say, okay, here's my total calories, because know your numbers was step one, right? Here's my total calories. How am I going to divide that over 4 meals? It can be even. You can backload some. You can, front load some, whatever works for you. That's a separate conversation. But you now can make the calorie deficit feel tangible in terms of how do you want to build your meals to hit now certain calorie thresholds, because you know you're eating 4 times that day.
Exactly. Yeah, so key. And also, I'm not waking up thinking when my meals are going to be, or if I'm going to run into the issue I talked about where my macros are done by 4 p.m. or I'm, a little bit hungry here or lacking energy here. It's like, it's all organized in a way. And depending on your lifestyle, you might shift. Like my meal structure's changed as my life's gone on. And that's why we have to be adaptable. But once you are in a consistent life schedule, then you can kind of lock it in. Yeah.
For sure. And I also think that when you know when you're going to eat, you kind of subtly alluded to this earlier, but I'm going to bring back up, like, you're not going like, oh my God, I'm starving and I haven't eaten yet. I'm going to eat anything in sight, right? Like you can actually be more prepared to be like, okay, like you said, I got half hour till my next meal. Cool. Or you know what? I know I've planned 4 meals today. I've prepped them all. I'm getting hungry. I'm going to eat that now, right? Like it makes it easier to go and actually live through your day with the confidence knowing that you're doing exactly what you plan to do because you're prepared and you know how many times you're eating. You can make sure you have the right food sources for each of those meals. You can make sure you're timing it. You can make sure you're eating when you're hungry. All of those, eating when you're hungry.
Yeah.
You can make sure all of those things apply.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll touch on this before we move on is even from a training perspective, if you're in a calorie deficit, you won't have ups and downs with training performance as much. If you lock in consistent meal timing and also the composition of your pre-workout meal, then you have a lot more predictability in how you're going to feel when you're training. Because if one day I eat, I don't know, a granola bar 4 hours away from my workout, and then the next day I have good protein oats with some fruits and dark chocolate an hour before my workout, I'm probably going to feel a lot different in that session. So if we want to predictably perform, which is how we're going to hold on to our muscle tissue, hopefully even build some along the way during our fat loss phase, then like that pre-workout meal, I think becomes more and more important. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So the predictability really becomes the key and to ease, right? Yeah. Because when you know things are predictable, you can plan ahead. So you can now then just focus on executing. And also our bodies love predictability, right? Like if we can give our body predictable inputs, we're never going to get predictable outputs with fat loss. It's very rare, but sometimes it happens, right? As predictable as possible, we're going to be able to see that progress.
Exactly.
Cool.
Awesome.
Amazing. Ultimately, everything that we've talked about today really brings us to the concluding thought that the more we can reduce the guesswork and the more intentional we can be, the easier it's going to get. Would you agree with that? What did you say?
100%. 100%.
Yeah. If you know your data, you know what food choices reduce hunger, you know kind of what helps you feel psychologically prepared, you know what your predictable eating schedule is going to be, you know exactly kind of, okay, this add-on means this amount of calories versus this swap means this amount of calories. Knowing and removing all the guesswork means that you can take a very streamlined approach to how you choose what to eat and how you organize your day of eating to make hitting a calorie deficit feel as easy as possible.
Love it. Great summary. I'm going to add one tiny thing before we wrap it up for today, and that is also to regularly include foods that you like.
Hey, yes. Oh my God. How did we wait this long to say that?
That's one of the key ones is like making sure you're eating something every day that you enjoy. And I'm not going to choose for you what you enjoy, but you know what it is. And usually there's also a slightly less calorie dense version of that. Like, for example, I love ice cream sandwiches, and there are pretty low calorie ice cream sandwiches. Yippee for me, right? So it's just like, so it's just like knowing what that is and regularly including it. So I say this again and again, we want to be living similarly, whether we're in a building, fat loss, or maintenance phase, instead of there being such drastic swings in how we operate. And that's why when I explain my meal schedule, it's the exact same when I'm in a building phase, maintenance, or in a fat loss phase. And as I said, just the amounts, and maybe some food choices change. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Oh my God, I'm so glad you said that, because if we think about easy, enjoyable inherently makes things easier.
Yeah.
Enjoyable inherently makes things easier. We did that whole episode, do you have to give up your favorite foods to see progress, right? And we explored all the ways you can make your favorite foods part of your daily intake, whether that's fat loss, surplus, maintenance, whatever goal you have. But especially in a calorie deficit, it's super important to be able to enjoy the foods you're eating, because then you'll stick to it. Like, you're going to
Yeah.
stick to the thing you like, right? It's going to
Adherence
feel
is
easier.
everything.
Adherence is everything.
Literally
Say that time
everything.
and time again. Adherence is everything. Okay, yours is
Okay.
ice cream sandwiches. I'm trying to think about other foods I've enjoyed during fat loss. Oh, the other thing you do a lot is your popcorn.
Yes,
Like
that is true. Yeah. Love
yeah,
a
your
lot of popcorn.
popcorn is a big part of your fat loss. And popcorn, a low calorie popcorn is also high volume. So there you've just
Super
checked
high
off
volume.
2
Yeah.
boxes. My, I think, favorite, I honestly eat this no matter what phase I'm in. Potatoes, you said boiled potatoes are like, obviously a good volume food. My air fryer potatoes, you've heard me talk about it before. And I'll just keep talking about it.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
that's one of my favorite foods I love to include. And makes my dinners both filling and enjoyable.
Awesome. Good episode.
Amazing. Okay, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Truth Talks. If you have any questions on how to make a calorie deficit easier for you, or any follow-ups, any favorite foods that you love that make it easy, any high volume foods you love that make it easy, drop a comment below. We'd love to hear it. And if you haven't already, we just have to say, subscribe if you want to hear more episodes like this, where we talk about the practical realities of building a physique that you can be proud of, whether that's fat loss or muscle building. So don't forget to subscribe so that you don't miss out on future episodes. Without further ado, we will leave you for this week, and we'll be back in your feeds with another episode of Truth Talks next Monday. Bye for now.